Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. We're excited that you've joined us. Our topic today is igniting your digital transformation with microservices. We've got an amazing panel, some great folks on here to talk about this topic. So today's webinar is sponsored by Perforce. My name is Mitch Ashley. I'll serve as your host and moderator. I have a couple of housekeeping items just want to cover. We are recording the webinar and we will be sending out an email to all participants with a link to slides and a link to the recording. So please hang out for that. We'll expect that after the webinar. Also, our speakers, we're going to be talking, having a lot of discussion, questions, etc. So it's a great forum for you to ask questions of any of us on the topics. And we have kind of a guided process that we'll use to do that. So please enter your questions into the questions tab on the GoToWebinar software. So let's get to our topic, igniting your digital transformation with microservices. I'd like to start by introducing our speakers, our panelists. First is Eran Kinsbrunner, who is Chief Evangelist with Perforce, and he's also an author and a columnist in InfoWorld.com, so you've probably seen his name around. We also have joining us Rod Cope, who's CTO with Perforce, and Curtis Johnson, Senior Solution Consultant with Perforce Software. And of course, my name is Mitch Ashley, and with Media Ops, DevOps.com. So let's start with a little bit of an introductory slide. But before we do that, could I have you gentlemen just say hello and introduce yourself? Eran, would you start?
Sure. Hi, Mitch. Hi, everyone. My name is Eran Kinsbrunner. I'm the Chief Evangelist for Perfector. I'm specializing in continuous testing in DevOps. So in today's topic, we're going to talk about microservices and innovation. So I'm representing the side of ensuring quality and value back to the clients. That's mostly my domain.
Great. Rod?
Yeah, hi, everybody. I'm Rod Cope, CTO at Perforce. I've got a 25 plus year history in software, including being CTO of RogueWave and founder and CTO of OpenLogic, helping companies with open source support. And I worked at some large companies like IBM and GE and Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, as well as some others. And I've been a worldwide speaker for the last 20 years on lots of technical topics, including recently quite a bit about digital transformation and microservices and API management.
Perfect for our webinar today. And great, Rod. And Curtis.
Hello, everybody. My name is Curtis. I have been working within the Perforce RogueWave company for several years now, but my main focus is more towards the development aspect of microservices, how we can make microservices useful and beneficial for developers as well, because they're the core to what all these microservices are all about.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, great experience from all of our panelists today. So let's kind of jump into our topic. Maybe I'll kick things off with just a little bit of a stage setting for our conversation. So if you're involved in any kind of contemporary software architecture, cloud native, et cetera, if you know about microservices, and if you aren't, it's probably something that will be getting involved in. Certainly there's a lot of advantages to how we build software today using microservices. Hopefully we're gone are the days of creating monolith applications where everything's built together and we strictly rely on segmentation or APIs, things like that, to divide up our software, our large applications. But the great thing about microservices is that now we can create and use repeatable services that perform specific functions in smaller containerized pieces of software, so they can be much more independent, easier to deploy, easier to implement. And when we get into talking about digital transformation, I think we'll see not only is that a preferred approach from an architectural standpoint, but it actually has some business benefits as well. And of course, those microservices around performing a specific function or set of functions. I mean, some folks are even talking about nano services these days, really small, very granular functions. So it's also very easy for you to add capabilities or to replace. So if you do need to do an upgrade or an update, you're not updating huge segments of code, you're updating a microservice that other microservices and parts of the applications are using. So there's much more flexibility around how teams can interact with creating microservices. Of course, you have to have ways of knowing about them and sharing them across organizations across the teams, and that's where some of the tools come in from that standpoint as well. So I think we'll probably be talking about some of those things too. So let me next just tie it to digital transformation. Now, microservices have certainly taken off along with containers and number of other technologies as a way to organize and create applications. And there's certainly some stats, and we see on the screen how much that has taken off in the growth, whether it's mobile apps or web apps, backend services, things like that. Thing I would like to really point out here is one of the drivers behind the microservices is that the business is looking for IT organizations, software teams to not only respond with new capabilities much more quickly, but to respond to business opportunities, maybe a competitive threat, maybe a new path to revenue, as well as increasing revenue, customer retention, those kind of things. And because of things like DevOps and microservices and API economies of ways of creating applications, that's allowing us to respond much more quickly to those business opportunities. And also when there's issues, if there's a problem, the business might be able to take a little bit more risk if we have the ability to respond much more quickly when a problem occurs. So there's a lot of information data to support why this is a great topic and why folks like Rod and Eran and Curtis not only implement but also talk a lot about these kind of technologies. So with that, let's move to our questions. I'd like to first start out with let's put a definition around digital transformation. So it's very buzzword-ish. Everybody uses it probably for lots of things. I know Rod, you said you're speaking a lot about this. Would you start out with that?
Sure. Yeah, I think there is a lot of ways to define digital transformation. I try to keep it fairly simple. I think of it as companies around the world kind of moving from traditional, often physical goods and environments to digital and bits. So you think about, used to get music by going to the mall and buying a CD from the CD store, and then along comes Apple and iTunes and you download bits. Or you went to Blockbuster to rent a physical movie. Now you go to Netflix and download bits. Or companies like Uber that basically just sell software. There's not a really physical presence. They leverage existing infrastructure. But it's not just those top tech companies going through digital transformation. It's all of the global 2000. It's even Campbell's Soup Company has a $125 million tech fund, right? So everybody is trying to figure out, how do we leverage our IP? How do we join digital ecosystems and marketplaces to work more closely with partners and customers than we ever did in the past? And we're doing that through software and bits and APIs, not just physical goods.
Eran, would you like to jump in? I appreciate your perspective on it too. I'm sure there's a lot you agree with there.
Sure. And I think that when you talk about digital transformation, you are also highlighting the platform. Okay, so Rod was talking about the movement from going to the mall, or you can actually look at from going to the bank to simply using your smartphones and tablets to consume a lot of content or actually get more value. And I think the digital transformation is all about getting more value with high degree of user experience anytime, everywhere, regardless of your age, your platform that you are using. And that's, I think, one of the opportunities that digital transformation gives, but also one of the biggest challenges for organizations behind the digital transformation to ensure constant user experience, constant quality of service.
Great. Curtis, I know you work with a lot of companies. What's your perspective?
I think that the big thing, kind of where Iran was going to at the end there, is it's about user experience or the customer experience, because I think that when you look at digital transformation, it is about giving the results in as quick and as an efficient way as possible, in a way that your end user is going to be benefiting the most in the quickest and most efficient way possible. And digital transformation is all about providing that for the end user. And I think that that really is where the rubber hits the road when it comes to how digital transformation has the ability to continue to transform throughout our society today.
Yeah, I think you all, of course, you all have, I think, covered it well. Just want to connect it to your point, Curtis. It's ultimately about the business, right? That's what the organization's looking for, and depending upon us as technologists, software engineers, architects, et cetera, to help facilitate creating and maximizing those business opportunities, customers' experience, et cetera. So our topic is, not only about digital transformation, but also some of the technical aspects of creating software. Things like, of course, microservices, the title of our topic, but also, accelerated development, like in Java, API management, API economy for applications. We're going to be delving into that, mobile testing. How do those things for you all, how does that connect into supporting a digital transformation strategy? Maybe Eran, if you want to jump in first.
Sure. So I think that, and as we just set the stage to where digital transformation brings organizations and the business, so things like Java development, API management, as well as the testing. So I think that these are all the enablers, the technology enablers, and the capabilities for organizations to transition from monolith, from old traditional software development into more microservices-oriented development and more agile fashioned software delivery. So I would look at the API management, the Java development, all of these as the enablers for digital transformation, and the mobile testing or the testing itself as the quality assurance behind digital transformation.
Great. I'm going to just jump in here. We're going to launch a poll, so I'd love our audience to respond with your thoughts while we're talking here, and then we'll discuss some of the poll results. So Curtis or Rod, whoever would like to jump in next.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think if you look at digital transformation, I think it's more of a business-led kind of initiative. How do we take advantage of more channels, join more marketplaces, and all the other things we talked about? But it's a sort of a business directive or requirement. How do we become more competitive and stay competitive in the future? And microservices, APIs, the continuous testing, things like that are kind of the technical implementation. It's a way to achieve business agility and flexibility, to keep delivering value, as we mentioned, better customer service, better developer experiences in the future. But it's really the technical implementation of a digital transformation.
Curtis?
And I think that when you get down to it, it's really, each of these different aspects are really focused on how we are able to make it happen. Often in the past, we would be so focused on just making the code work. And now we actually are, it feels as though development is focused not just on making the code work, but making it work well. And all of these different technologies that, whether it be focusing on the way that we're developing our code or how we're working through our API management, all of these, or even the way that we're testing our mobile applications, all of those are really focused on and centralized on how we are able to make those things actually be done better, which I think is something very unique in this day and age. That in the past it was more of a scramble. You're trying to figure it out, and hopefully it works, and if it does, great, and then if it doesn't, you'll figure it out, and you keep trying to figure it out and figuring it out, and it was always more of a reactive means of dealing with issues within these environments. These types of discussion points really are really providing us with an option that allows us to be a little bit more proactive in the way that we're actually able to address these types of technical issues and be able to have more of a digital deal with that digital transformation within these environments.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Let's share the results of our poll. We had really good participation from our audience here, from participants. So looks like we kind of hit the numbers here. 70% of people said all of these things are important to positioning for 2020 and beyond for their digital transformation, digital business. Any surprises in the results for you guys?
this is a run for my end. I think, by working with Perfector as a cloud solution, which bakes inside its solution a lot of AI and machine learning algorithms in our software testing abilities. For me, it's not a surprise. I think that I was probably expecting a higher degree on the big data and analytics, because as you are practicing a lot of microservices, DevOps, and delivering software in a more agile fashion, you are also creating much more volume of data that you want to be able to support quite fast. And for that, you do need to have a more rigorous and robust smart big data analytics abilities, which are being built these days. So I was probably expecting a higher percentage on the big data analytics front, but all in all, I think that these, in my mind, are clearly trends that are shaping and going to shape going forward the DevOps and microservices technologies.
Mm-hmm. I think too, one of the ways to look at this data, because all the above 70% means they're voting for the other four. So big data analytics would be like 85%, 76% for AI. So they're all quite high, right? Maybe it should be 100% data. I don't know. Other thoughts, guys?
I was going to say that I thought it was interesting for the microservices and cloud SaaS solutions. I think that it proves, I mean, obviously, we probably have a large amount of people that are focused on what are we going to be able to do to provide these services, microservices in a cloud solution. There's so many things out there currently that are providing solutions in that, but then also standardizing that process and making it so that like that is what we're actually working through, especially on a DevOps methodology of writing code and being a part of the developer and operations aspects of these applications. Understanding the cloud and how that works is obviously a big part of where digital transformation is going to be going forward, I believe.
Great. Let me hide the results of that. Why don't we move on to our microservices part of our conversation here. Would anyone like to start out with kind of give us a good definition, standard definition, maybe commonly used? Curtis, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, absolutely. So microservices, when it comes down to it, what it really is it's providing a solution for the way in which you're actually able to write your applications. In the past, I feel like it's hard to talk about microservices without talking about how it used to be. We have the focus towards a monolithic, single-based application. Everything is included and entranced within one base application. And what microservices is essentially doing is it's breaking it up. It's making it so that you can have individual teams that are focusing on specific services that are going to provide functionality within the entirety of the application. This provides you with the ability to create small, agile teams that can focus on specific services within the application. This also allows them to focus more towards those specific services and understanding those services and executing on those. And when there is an issue that occurs, being able to address those, as well as using the specific technology that's going to be most beneficial for that specific service.
Great. Yeah. Feel free to jump in, guys, whoever's next.
Well, I think that was a pretty good definition.
Okay.
We can start from.
We don't have to do a poll to find out where you agree with Curtis. Nice job, Curtis. Well, let's talk about, I mean, so why do we do this? I mean, you partially covered this, I think, in your definition, Curtis. But why or how do microservices impact the way that developers are able to create applications? Obviously, if it's taking on, it's more than just an interest, kind of the next wave of things. People are really doing this, so they must be really finding benefits. So how would you answer the why question?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. I think there's definitely pros and cons to monoliths, microservices, mini services. There are challenges involved with all those. I think the main kind of challenge that microservice solves, and Curtis touched on this, monoliths are hard to change. And so just by adding a little bit of functionality or trying to tweak some functionality to keep up with business needs, it could take a monolith team perhaps 6 months or a year to make a change, or there's not enough test coverage. I'm sure Ron would be happy to point out that sometimes there's not a lot of automated tests involved with monoliths and old technologies, and so people are afraid to touch it. It might break something, it might fix one thing, break something else. The nice thing about microservices are because you have small teams, solving small problems with small solutions, it's easy to change your mind, it's easy to tweak things, it's easy to innovate by trying out the next language or platform or technology to come down the pike. You're not stuck with something for a decade because, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Leave it alone if it's in production, kind of a mindset of the past. So I think that's the main reason people are going to microservices: business agility, flexibility, avoiding getting locked into tech that gets stale.
Just one more comment, because I think Curtis and Rod, you covered everything. I just want to add 2 points here. So one of the things which I've been experiencing with teams that moved to microservices is the time to value. Okay, as you are breaking software into smaller pieces, you are able to also deliver value much faster. And B, it's a better utilization of your entire software development teams, because you have smaller teams, you have better focus and control over what each and every feature team squad is actually doing. So you actually have a better control over your entire software delivery lifecycle. So I think that that's a win-win here.
As you both kind of talked about moving to microservices, without maybe naming names of companies, or any examples of projects or applications you've been through that moved from a monolith to a more of a microservices architecture? You can share some examples.
Yeah, so I actually had a client about a little while ago that had a monolith-based application, and they very big in finance field, and they recently moved into a microservices, and so they actually set up their services directly through Docker, and essentially they completely broke up their teams up, and so they had basically one whole development team, and they had like 200 developers or so that were all working on this huge application, and then they still have people working on it to this day, but they have slowly taken parts of it, and that's actually an interesting aspect to what microservices is. It's never something that very few times can you just go to microservices and just say, hey, we're good. You usually have to take parts of it and bring them in, make a microservice applications, and then you just keep bringing more and more over. And so they've been making transitions as they've been doing it, moving more and more of their application into the microservice environment. But then they've also focused a lot on that process of creating processes that are going to help to ensure that while they're writing those microservices, that they're doing it right, that they're doing it as efficiently as possible as well. So, yeah.
I think that's a good.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, a good point. Yeah, no problem. Kind of a good point. A lot of teams start with a monolith and then transition to microservices when they get to a point where the monolith is too hard to maintain or too slow to keep up with the times, and that's a lot of people actually recommend that as a best practice. As Curtis mentioned, if you just start with microservices, you're actually more likely to fail because you don't really know what problem you're solving yet. You kind of need almost the simplicity of a monolith to understand what the problem is, and then use something like the strangler pattern to slowly move over key pieces of functionality into microservices, and then slowly shutting down the monolith. Now that you know what you're doing, that it is succeeding in the business, that it can get the funding it needs, that it's got a long-term future, now it's worth investing in a microservice architecture. And I think the other thing to point out is there's probably as big a shock to the system related to cultural change with the people and organization as there is technology, because a lot of typical environments are, when they're monolithic, can be top-down command and control, could be the team of DBAs versus the team of developers versus the QA team, and they throw things over the wall at each other, and there's infighting and all those kind of things. Going to microservices is a huge change in process, communication, the tools that you need, the way you think about problems, the funding that's needed, all that. And I think that's something that some teams jump in a little too soon before they get the executive sponsorship and kind of the rope they need to do it right. And there's a risk of failing pretty miserably if you don't have that in mind up front.
You know, if I can share just a brief story from my own experience, I worked with a company who had a 15-year-old .NET application. One of those nobody wanted to touch so much of it because, you know, it wasn't necessarily brittle, but just folks didn't know, and you don't want to mess something up. And we actually moved it to the cloud, but part of that was taking one segment, this functionality called location services, and rebuilding that portion in microservices, leaving the rest alone. But that was where we were focusing kind of our digital transformation business value. And that was a great way for the team to adopt or come up to speed on microservices, because you're not trying to eat the whole elephant. So the strategy you talked about, Rod, makes a lot of sense. I'm going to throw up our next poll on where are you on your microservices journey. So if we could have our participants, our audience, let us know, where are you? You know, kind of in the thinking about it, done not thinking about it, like all the way, you know, in the deep end of the pool. While we're doing that, a couple questions from our audience. First one is, when you speak of microservices, are you talking about back-end RESTful APIs, or are you including front-end web mobile as well? Jump in, whoever would like to take it.
I can take that one. I'm sure the other guys can jump in too. When I think of microservices, I'm thinking pretty clearly on back-end services, so not UI. Now they may support one or more UIs, but typically they're behind, ideally, an API management solution like an Akana that's providing consistent security and policies and analytics and things like that for all your APIs. The microservices are then the implementation mechanism for those APIs that are typically on-prem or could be in the cloud, but they're sort of conceptually behind the firewall and protected a bit so they can have direct access to each other and your data sources and maybe other RESTful APIs. They could be implemented with REST, or they could use gRPC or WebSockets. It doesn't really matter, but I think of it as clearly a sort of behind-the-scenes server-side implementation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Totally agree with that. I can actually speak from you know, Perfector's implementation. Perfector actually, which is a cloud solution for testing web and mobile application, shifted from its monolith based application to microservices. And as just mentioned, yeah, most of the microservices are back end, providing all the capabilities and infrastructure across, you know, test reporting and test execution and other reliant activities or capabilities that we have in the portfolio. So yeah, totally agree.
Very good. Another question we have sort of related is, how are microservices different from object-oriented programming principles and modeling?
I would say they're orthogonal. You can implement your microservice with any kind of technology, language, platform. It could be traditional application server if you want, or it could be much more lightweight. Maybe it could be Node.js. It could be PHP, Python. It doesn't really matter how you implement it. You can use object-oriented techniques in your implementation, but they're really sort of orthogonal points. You can use microservices with or without object-oriented programming, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Supports a lot of technologies. Yeah, go ahead.
I think, yeah, one is the what, and the other can be the how. Okay, you can implement the microservices, which is the what, through object-oriented programming or other methodology.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think that covered it well. Let's close our poll. Take a look at the results here, and appreciate our questions from our participants, our audience. Great. So, looking at this, 16% not looking at it yet or don't have plans to do it. 29% are planning, maybe haven't jumped in yet. 24% prototyping. So, you know, probably looks like about 30+% are in the process of using it in a pretty serious way in production, and another quarter, 24%, that are in that prototyping, building, experimenting phase. Any surprises from those results, Of course, we don't know who our audience kind of self-select because of our topic name for the webinar, but any observations about those results?
Well, personally, I think it's kind of good. The 16% that don't have plans to jump in yet are doing the right thing by attending this webinar. They're kind of figuring out, is this right for them, and looking at pros and cons, and then some people have kind of jumped in. But I'm a little bit surprised that they're 16% is a pretty high number that are in the planning stage. So I think that's good.
Oh, the 29% in the planning phase?
Oh, I'm sorry, 16% with no plans yet that are kind of figuring it out.
Yeah. Yeah, anybody else? I just throw in an observation here. 11%, again, given our topic, and we may have folks that are approaching, not heavily invested in microservices yet, but 11% in production with many services. It is one of those, as you get in, you create a lot of services. So I'm not too surprised to see our audience is, in more of the beginning, kind of middle phases of their journey. So good to know. Appreciate everyone sharing those results. Any other thoughts before we move on?
I feel as though most companies are, I would argue that most companies are going to not, even the ones that are fully in microservices, are still going to have a number, few services, that they're not going to be. I could see most of the people that are in production with few services being ready to go and not going to be changing it any further, and be happy with the few services that they do have, beyond even going and trying to expand it beyond that point. I've seen that be the case often as well. So,
and just one comment, Mitch, without repeating, I think there is a key word in the question, which is the journey. And I think this is how you should treat it. It's, from my experience, it's very complicated, and it's quite a risk to do the transition towards microservice. While you do have tons of benefits, moving from a walking implementation to a microservices takes time. It involves a lot of considerations and investments. So you do want to take it very carefully, step by step. So I understand, the guys that are planning and looking into that, making it very, very calculated.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Before I move on, because we want to talk a little bit about API approach to building API economy. We do have a question from one of our participants. Any suggestions for testing microservices? What kind of tools can be used for testing? I think that kind of fits right in your wheelhouse, Aaron, I'm guessing, if you want to take that to start with.
So the guy who asked might not like my response, which is depends, because while we do have a lot of microservices which, as mentioned earlier, rely on back-end activities, but they do at the end of the day also involve a lot of front-end and client-related stuff. So I would say, depending on the technologies, whether it's a cloud solution which has web interfaces or stuff like that at the front end. So it can be a mix of API testing solutions, ones that mentioned earlier, like Akana. It can be Selenium for front-end testing of a web interface, or it can be Appium and other frameworks, open source frameworks for the mobile front of this overall project. So the bottom line is that it's not just one tool. That's what I want to convey. Microservices operate a lot of things. So depending on the application, the technologies, it will involve a set of tools from front end to back end that you want to have as a tool stack for your practitioners.
And I would add on to that just a little bit, because part of that also is not even just the front end to back end, but also the early stages of your development process all the way up and through production, because there's also aspects where you have to look at it not just across, but also across the timeline of your developing and writing applications. Because when you're working in microservices, typically you're going to have more of a DevOps mindset, which results in you actually, being more integrally interested in the way you're developing throughout the operations aspect as well. And so when you have that mindset, you need tools that are going to help you in your development environment. And so like tools like our XRebel product, which actually can give you direct information into what you're doing as you're developing your code, so that as you're operationally moving in, you can set up your APM tools in that production scenario and also get the information you need as well. So I believe that there's also solutions throughout the timeline as well.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, testing's a whole nother subject, right?
Yeah, we could do a whole session on that.
We can, and probably will someday. So let's talk a little bit about the API side of this. I think several of you have mentioned. I like to think about this sort of API economy or API architecture. Some of the teams I've worked with more recently think about the whole application as everything is APIs, right? It's all built around this architecture. So that, though you talked about the front end, the back end, it's all based on, an API design, not just on, calls between functions or calls between services. Would one of you see if you can put a little better definition around what we mean by an API-based architecture, API economy?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I think, a lot of companies are starting to move to an API first kind of strategy for development. So if you think about again, we keep comparing to the way we used to do things to make it more clear. It used to be you're thinking in terms of an application or a project, and it would have a UI and business logic and data access all rolled into one. So kind of hard to pry that apart to reuse just bits and pieces of it. So if I wanted to create a new application, maybe I have a new channel or type of customer or partner I want to go after, I might have to rewrite. I might not be able to easily access the bit of that monolith I need. And for that reason, companies are starting to move to, well, what if we had an API platform? What if we had this sort of catalog of APIs that exposed access to our core intellectual property, our functionality, our unique data and transformations, AI, what have you? Then we could repurpose those APIs in lots of different applications, lots of different ways. And so that's driving this approach of, well, first create the API because the UI may change tomorrow. Maybe we'll have web, maybe we'll have mobile, maybe we'll have voice. We're not sure what's going to come next, but we know we're going to use it in a bunch of different ways for a long time. So start with the API and then build up from there.
Interesting. Anybody else want to add perspective on that? Great. I'm gonna launch a poll here that we were talking about. Think of this conversation both about microservices and API, and start to talk about what some of the challenges are. It actually fits well into a question that we received from one of our participants around what are some of the best practices for that. A question I have for you about API architectures, when we say that, are we really talking about APIs that are strictly meant for external things outside of our applications, other companies, other third-party apps to interface with? Is this also internal to the application? And if it's internal, how's that different from microservices?
It's definitely both. External, I think, gets more attention because that typically is how the business thinks in terms of expanding into new channels and marketplaces and working with customers and driving revenue. But there's also a huge need and benefit from thinking in terms of internal APIs as well. So you go faster in development. There's a lot more reuse. You're not reinventing the wheel. It's more assembling the pieces. So if you're a large organization, and you've gone forward with API first, or you're thinking in terms of an API catalog or platform, now you have a very fast way for a new developer tackling a new application or challenge to kind of assemble the pieces. Okay, there's already 3 or 4 APIs existing in our company that support what I want to do. I'm going to be much faster and have much better results and better quality by reusing what's already there. So I'd say absolutely internal and external. And you asked how it differs from microservices.
Yeah.
Again, the API, I think of the API as kind of the interface. The microservice is the implementation. So you would still have a well-defined API with inputs and outputs and error parameters and all the expectations of kind of a contract between the consumer and the provider of an API. How that provider implements the API is up to them. They can use microservices, but they don't have to.
Mm-hmm. Great. Other thoughts, Aaron, Curtis?
No, I think this is all great. It makes sense to me. So spot on.
Okay, good. I think it's also, you mentioned kind of getting started. That's another one of those, I don't know if you say philosophical, but architectural principles. You have to take a stab at it to bite at the apple and kind of build your chops as you learn how to design well-formed APIs that are resilient and not brittle across releases, and get backwards compatibility, things like that. So all other things to consider. I'm gonna
Absolutely.
go ahead. Yeah, thank you, Ron. I'm gonna go ahead and toss up the results of the poll that we just did. You're asking, what are some of the biggest challenges with microservices? And I think several of you mentioned things about the impact to people and the change, the amount of change. What's interesting too is we're doing a lot of change at once. We just talked about microservices and APIs here, but cloud and big data and all kinds of automated CI/CD, DevOps, DevSecOps. A lot of changes that are happening all at once here. So
Well, it's
people,
really encouraging how
right?
low the lack of executive sponsorship is. That encourages me that people, at least they're willing to investigate and look into the potential for microservices, and they're not pushing you back too much or as much.
Mm-hmm. Do you know some successful strategies you've seen for people that have been able to get the right level of sponsorship in their organization? Things that have worked?
Well, for me, what I've seen is actually some of the issues that people are expressing when it comes to like providing a legitimate structure behind it, actually coming out with legitimate like strategies behind it. That's the hardest part, is to figure out which one works the best, because as we've kind of talked about, there's a lot of different approaches to the way that you can be able to make the transition into microservices, how you're going to be able to pull that off, whether which one's going to work the best and for your team and for your specific projects. I think that provides you with the means to be able to more effectively get your executive team to buy in on microservice setup.
Mm-hmm.
Megan, this is Ran. I
Yeah.
just want to say one sentence here, and I think that if you look at the breakdown of the answers, you actually can split, the people element, because at the end of the day, we are talking at the human resource that is going to make the difference between a successful transition, a successful adoption of technology, and a failure. So there is a clear separation here between enabling the organization, feature team, people through processes, support from executives and stuff like that, versus, enabling them through technology, okay? Which tools, which monitoring infrastructure and stuff like that they will have in order to be successful in their journey, as we mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, you could say the first three are people related, right? And the
Exactly.
bottom two are technical.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, one more comment on this. This is just, I guess, interesting results. We all got a lot to say on this one.
Good.
Curtis pointed out that lack of executive sponsorship is pretty low, which is good. I also kind of wonder if that's because some people aren't sure if they have it or not, so they didn't check the box yet. Maybe it's a little cynical, but I would say in general, all the other answers had a pretty high response, meaning there are a lot of challenges with microservices. It's not like this is a slam dunk easy thing to do for either the technical or the people side of things. So keep that in mind as you're going through your journey. Expect that it won't be as smooth sailing as it looks like on paper, and make sure you have help in place and plan to get help to get through it.
Well, I think the poll questions we've had have been really pretty well designed, because a prior one showing where folks were on their microservices journey helps inform these responses, right? Because if more of our audience, more of our participants are earlier in that process, there's going to be a lot of questions about people. Maybe they haven't gotten to some of the challenges around executive support yet. You know, DevOps may be early in stages in adopting that too. I mean, I'm kind of reading in and connecting those. Maybe they're not always correlated, but it seems like there is correlation there.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yep.
Great. But, you know, interesting still is tools, platforms, et cetera, are still, you know, at that 48%. So it isn't like the technology isn't a question too. It's all part of the equation.
Right.
Okay, excellent.
No free lunch.
No free lunch. But, you know, I think the great thing is, I mean, I would suggest anyone listening to this might, for example, need help with that executive sponsorship, depending on who you're talking to. If it's a more technical audience, this webinar recording might be a good resource to draw from in the future. You have somebody listen to it, or, you know, pull some of the information, the poll, go back and show your manager, right? Hey, we're not the only one. Here's what maybe we should be thinking about, that kind of thing. Okay.
Good idea.
Cool. Let's do this. We've got about 15 minutes yet, and we're doing pretty good on our audience questions. Please throw in more questions if you have more questions from folks that are listening in today. I want to jump into kind of thinking about the future of where we're headed with all this and kind of what's next. Maybe Eran, you know, how are teams ensuring things like issues like continuous brand innovation, high user experience, all of those kind of things in this environment where so much is changing? We still have to be ensuring that we're delivering the right things to the business and to the end customers. What are some of the ways we can address that, maybe through testing and other approaches?
Sure, and if we go back to, I think, the first or the second poll, we have seen some of the trends that people also believed will shape 2020 and beyond. A few of them mentioned AI and machine learning. A few of them talked about BI and data analytics and stuff like that. So obviously, when you are looking at a digital landscape today, most of the businesses today are digital, mobile, web. Today, we're looking at foldable smartphones that are reinventing the mobile landscape and other exciting technologies. So I think that as we implement more and more microservices, as we become more agile in delivering software, I think that we are starting to also require more control over our code quality, code impact analysis, machine learning algorithm that can help us learn about trends that are going on, whether from our user perspective or our own performance. Okay, we are delivering very sophisticated software today. Again, can be mobile, can be through web. We are seeing today progressive web applications. Okay, progressive web applications are actually taking the entire mobile technology, placing it inside a browser. Okay, so being able to address all of this innovation requires you to be more smart, or smarter than ever, if you like, in being able to monitor data, drive faster decisions, again, understand the impact of each and every code change, whether it's through microservices or monolith, it doesn't matter. You want to have full control over what you are delivering. And to do it, you need, again, the monitoring tools as well as continuous testing.
You know, a question about testing, since you went into that continuous testing, how would you define the difference between just automating the software testing and continuous testing?
Oh, so yeah, I won't go long. I actually wrote a book just about that because it's quite complicated. Quite complicated to explain, but test automation has a specific, I would say, meaning or objective behind it. You want to automate a set of actions to validate, that one set of, code areas work properly. Continuous testing uses test automation, if you like, to address or to assess business value or business risks after each and every code change. So test automation enables continuous testing. Continuous testing, while you cannot automate each and every line of code and stuff like that, you want to have like a machine that goes on, and upon each and every code change, it can pick the right high-value test cases, execute them, and provide you the feedback so you can assess if there are any risks. So one enables the other. Continuous testing is test automation on steroids, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any kind of lessons learned from that test automation, continuous testing, Eran or Curtis, Rod, you can share from your experiences?
I think Eran's the pro.
He wrote the book.
He wrote the book, yeah.
He wrote the book.
So I would say in one or two words, it's simply hard, okay? Being successful in test automation today, and you don't need to read my book or take my word for it, go to the World Quality Report, speak to any of our customers, being able to keep up with high degree of functioning test automation is simply hard because there are constant changes. That we're talking about digital transformation. The evolution of platforms continuously changes. I'll just give you Apple, okay? iOS 13 has 8 releases over the last 8 weeks. It's like a release per week. You need to keep up with all these changes. Even if you didn't change any line of code in your iOS application, you want to make sure that Apple didn't ruin anything in your application functionality. So it's hard, and test automation is quite brittle because of the changes in the environment, in the digital environment. So you need to make sure that you are automating only the right things so you can actually have control. You want to have quality visibility so you can assess if things are changing and you can catch them in time. And you need to have the developer support at the end of the day to be successful in automation. Test engineers cannot be successful on their own. It's a team work here. So one needs to support the other.
I just want to mention too, not that we're here selling books, but the name of your book is Digital Quality Handbook and Continuous Testing for DevOps Professionals. I assume that's on Amazon and other places, right, Eran?
Yes, it's on Amazon. Yeah.
Very nice. Well, we have a little bit of time left here, and I do want to get to some of the information about the products that Perforce offers. And let me kind of jump ahead to a slide here. Those are a couple of names of the product. I'm going to launch a poll just to gauge some interest on this. But we probably need a little bit of background. Maybe Rod, can you give us a little bit on what the products are, or Curtis, whoever would like to take a stab at it? And I know we've mentioned all of these along the way.
Yeah, we could probably each one of us talk a little bit about one of them. I'll pick Akana. So Akana is an API management platform. Kind of the key claim to fame there is it's got the deepest and broadest security implementation in the industry. So if you think about exposing your APIs on the public internet, basically every hacker in the world can get straight to your API, kind of by definition. So having a consistent, deeply secure implementation, regardless of if you're using microservices, for example, you've got lots of teams, lots of different geographies, lots of different experience levels, languages, platforms, stacks, on the cloud, on premises. You don't want all those teams doing security their own different way. That would be kind of a disaster, right? So I think of Akana as an API management tool is kind of like an API firewall, right? You're first in the primary line of defense. It also has a developer portal built in, so you can discover what APIs exist in the organization and get Swagger and RAML open AI or API documentation, test it live, get keys, all those kind of things, as well as the ability to consistently apply policies to all your APIs to, for example, scrub sensitive information from going into logs, or to require authentication and authorization, and give you consistent business analytics, operational analytics, the whole thing. And then on the technical side, it also does things like transform various protocols and data formats. So for example, you might want to expose a REST API based on JSON, but internally you're talking to older, maybe legacy systems that use SOAP, for example. So you're dealing with XML or even mainframes, and Akana can seamlessly translate all that for you, so that you tell the world we have the most modern REST JSON OAuth 2.0, and then internally you can have SAML and SOAP and XML and mainframe and all that stuff, and Akana will translate back and forth for you, so you don't have to write any code to deal with those situations. So it's a pretty comprehensive end-to-end API management tool.
That's what I was going to say. Very rich, very deep. Curtis, maybe you want to hit on JRebel, XRebel? You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah, so JRebel and XRebel are development-centric tools. And so as we're looking at microservices and discussing microservices, one of the big aspects of this is the way that we are working in our development teams. Each of these small individual teams need the ability to be able to write code, write it fast, and be able to monitor the performance of that application as they're writing that code. And that's what JRebel and XRebel provide for you. JRebel focuses mainly on the speed aspect, giving you the ability to make changes in your code and immediately see it get reflected. And that's great, because if you're using Docker or any other kind of microservice-based environment, you want to be able to make quick changes in your code and get the reflections shown. Our other tool is XRebel, and what that provides you with is the ability to understand the performance of the application. So you can actually see how your application is performing, get details into critical information like how long your requests are taking, how many queries are being called, and then breakdowns of all of the loggings that have happened and errors that might be occurring. The idea providing you with that mindset of that DevOps mindset of, hey, I'm going to be able to identify these issues and be able to address these issues as I'm developing my application, so that once I commit this and put it into production, you've got the most efficient and best version of your application possible.
Great. Eran, how about Perfecto? I think you've kind of delved into it a little bit in some of your testing talking.
Yeah, I'll just make it brief. So Perfector is a continuous testing platform in the cloud, software as a service. You do not need to install anything. It aims to support testing of mobile native applications as well as cross-browser application through Selenium, Appium, and other common standard open source frameworks, all in the cloud. So you do not need to actually purchase any smartphone, any tablet. You do not need to build any grid of browser permutation like Chrome on Windows 7 or Safari on different Mac OS. We virtualize, we provide you access through the cloud to all the different digital platforms, mobile and web, to develop and execute, as well as analyze all of the test results.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you to our audience for letting us know your interest in those areas. We're just coming up on the top of the hour. It's really flown by. It's been a quick 58 and a half minutes here. So I'd like to wrap up just by thanking our panelists today. All three of you have been wonderful and great conversation with each of you. And I think we've had a lot of interest, like some great questions as well from our audience. So Eran Kinsbrunner, who is Chief Evangelist Author with Perfecto, Rod Cope, CTO, Perforce Software, and Curtis, Senior Solutions Consultant, as well as with Perforce. This is Mitch Ashley. It's been my pleasure to be your host and moderator. Just a reminder, we will be sending out an email with a link to the recording as well as the slides, and you can check out DevOps.com for other future webinars that are coming up that may be of interest. So thank you for spending your hour with us. We know your time is super valuable, and the fact that you chose to spend it all with us, we value that very much. Appreciate it. All right, everyone, have a great day and be safe out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.